Hello, my name is Rebecca Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of the Old Swedes Historic Site, and today's presentation is by George Ambrose. George has a Master's in Education from Temple University. He was a senior teacher at the Penwood High School from 1998 to 2019, where he taught world literature, environmental science. Additionally, he is the president of the board of the Friends of the Swedish Cabin. He's on the board of the Cobbs Creek Community Environmental Education Center. He has published 3 books and over 30 articles. George has, you may have known one of his books, The Swedish Log Cabin, and he's taking that a little bit further in his presentation, Hiding in Plain Sight. Since the colony of the New Sweden existed in what are now the states of Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, there's been little physical remnants of the colony found in that area. This presentation will look at the historic tradition, the modifications, and the controversies surrounding the ongoing search for New Sweden. George?
Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. As recently as 1982, Jean Fever wrote the introduction to her book, 17th Century Survivors, Pre-1700 Buildings in the 5-County Philadelphia Area, with the following lament. How few 17th century structures remain in the 5-County Philadelphia area, and only 5 within the city proper. The creep of urban development and redevelopment has not spared the old and the vulnerable. Nostalgia for the old days and its physical appearance makes us regret the vanishing of so much of our architectural past. Likewise, James Dietz, writing in 1977 in Small Things Considered, says the factors that allowed the survival of one house and the destruction of another are probably numerous and complex, but it seems a reasonable assumption that the simpler and ruder houses of early America have long since vanished. This presentation will focus on the architecture of New Sweden on the Delaware and its tributaries between 1638 and 1655, and try to explain why so little of that era survives. It will look at the physical structures which comprise New Sweden, but also the buildings of the Dutch and the English along the river in this area. It will also examine 4 critical anniversaries that drew attention to the history of the United States as well as New Sweden and the efforts to find our past, especially its architecture. This presentation draws on both the written and photographic records of 3 states comprising most of New Sweden, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. The written works are both transcripts from the colonial records as well as chronicles by researchers such as Dr. Amandus Johnson, pictured here, C.A. Westlager, also here, Terry Jordan, and others. Restoration architect Warren Eck, who oversaw work at the Lower Swedish Log Cabin, always said, quote, "Let the building tell its story." Further study has teased 2 new stories out of the lower cabin, and they will also be related here today. So what are we looking for and where? First and foremost, we are looking for the physical constructs erected during the 17-year time span of New Sweden. The searches were conducted in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, as all 3 states border the Delaware River, as well as their tributaries, because settlers did move up those tributaries as waterways were the early roads. The historical records identify several distinct architectural works in the colony. New Sweden structures include log cabins and their attendant outbuildings, such as stuga, eldhus, storehouse, barn, smoke house, sauna, forts and blockhouses, including earthworks, stockades, and palisades, churches, both initial and subsequent, usually referred to as the early log churches and then the subsequent stone and brick churches, storehouses, of which there were a few, and then mills. There were one or two of those, a windmill and this tub mill. And then finally the Prince-off, which is the exception to most of the rules of what was constructed in the time of New Sweden. So first of all, let's look at the geography of New Sweden, because as realtors always say, location, location, location. Stuyvesant, in bringing the Kelmore nickel over, wanted to sneak in between the Dutch who were in the north of the Delaware and the English who were in the south. And so he came in and settled in what is now present-day Wilmington and moved the settlements north around that. It was sparsely populated, however. At its zenith, it only had about 350 people. Settlements were scattered, not clusters in hamlets or villages, and not always well constructed because it was done hastily in some cases, especially in the case of fortifications, which were done out of necessity or in time of emergency. Settlements were built next to rivers and creeks which flooded, but they provided vital transportation in an era without roads. Construction materials therefore had to be imported by boat or fabricated on the site. Two major influences on the construction of New Sweden include military precedents and folk building traditions. Forts, blockhouses, and earthworks were adaptations of what was used in Europe during the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. Time, that urgency, manpower, the limited number of hands available, and the materials, depending on where you were when you needed to build, were the limitations on these constructions. Many were subsequently abandoned or surrendered. As far as settlers, few settlers were Swedish, most were Finns, and were considered outlaws. They lived accordingly, more in sync with the native American population than with the European colonies. Settlers were most frequently forest-dwelling Finns who adopted the raw resources of America to recreate the folk architecture that they used at home. Many structures were the work of single households. As McAllister says in her Guide to American Houses, vernacular building is folk building, done without the benefit of formal plans. Such structures are frequently built by their occupants. They also are a group that preferred distance between neighbors. So, what contributed to the disappearance of physical New Sweden were things like time, weather, lack of the proper tools and materials, and poor or hasty workmanship, which all took their toll. Contemporary records are telling on this account. Governor Ritter, who was the second governor of New Sweden, complained that he did not have, quote, a man able to build a common peasant's house or able to saw a board of lumber. New Sweden was originally a mercantile colony without the intention of really a colonial settlement. Settlers came later and were often forced to come. And then military workmanship was not much better. After only 5 years of the New Sweden colony, newly arriving Governor Riesing put soldiers and laborers to work repairing Fort Christina, replacing old rotting palisades. This is a direct quote. Repairs were also made on some of the decayed log dwellings within the fort. Now, we have two cabins in Upper Darby, or we had two cabins until very recently, called the Upper Cabin and the Lower Cabin. And they have a very interesting similarity in that there was originally a four-wall structure constructed in the mid to late 1640s, And then about 5 years later, around circa 1650 to 52, there was a wave of Swedish settlers who came over and needed a place to stay. And Terry Jordan, in his book, the American Log Cabin Experience, shows that the notches shown here under the mortar and stones picture, the notches on those logs are distinct from Värmland province, which at the time was a highly concentrated Finnish population. And so he said it is certain that that original cabin on the site was built by Finns from Värmland. Now, the addition, which you see stones between the logs in that picture, was built about 5 years later. And we know that because we were able to examine 2 sets of white oak logs. Both sides were built out of white oak, and the side with the stones between the logs had 5 more rings than the ones in the original cabin. Therefore, the addition was built 5 years later. However, both that one and the upper Swedish cabin had an addition added that consisted only of 3 of its own walls. The 4th wall was shared with the original cabin and joined by a trough, which I had marked on these drawings with a red line. And you see the board in the photograph. And what we see is that that was a hasty construction. And how do we know that it was a hasty construction? Number one, all sorts of time-saving things were done in the construction. First and foremost was it was only 3 walls. Secondly, the daubing, the filling in between the logs is much larger and was done primarily with stones and just the pure mix of the daubing used at the time, mud and straw, was jammed in between the stones. Again, a hasty method of construction. If you look down at the notching pictures, the grayish picture on the right shows a rafter crossing over the top joint in the original cabin and very carefully sawn. You can see a white bit of daubing and then 2 black saw marks indicating a very precise fitting, whereas the notching for the addition was whacked out by an axe, as in that center picture. And then the picture on the left shows a rafter going over that top log that is supported in that joint very loosely and takes extra daubing to hold it in place. And then finally, the process of chamfering at the bottom pictures on the right show the logs being squared on 2 sides and then put into a wooden trough. And there's a good close-up in that bottom right-hand corner of 2 logs going into that, and then they were held with iron spikes. The presence of iron spikes is also an indication of the passage of time because most log cabins were built without any iron, especially nails. Now, what about the prints off? Well, first, no image of the print off is known to exist. I was able, with an internet search, to find a representation of a gourd, G-A-R-D, with an accent over the A, which is a country manor house built out of logs, and you can see that those logs are squared, and it's a 2-story high building. So what do we know about the prints off? Governor Prince brought his wife and 5 daughters to New Sweden. He ordered construction of a guard or a manor house suitable for them. It included hewn logs, meaning that they were squared, whereas those cabins we just looked at had round logs with the bark on. These are squared logs with the bark removed. It was also built to a height of 2 stories. The interior had sawn planks. The fireplaces and chimneys were made of yellow bricks brought from Sweden. It also had windows made of glass, as you can see here, with lavish draperies, also brought from Sweden. It was the talk of the town among the settlers of New Sweden when they saw a house of such extravagant proportions. They knew that a very self-centered governor had arrived and was using all of his resources to live lavishly. Unfortunately, 2 years after that house was constructed, a guard on duty, Sven Voss, fell asleep, and the compound at Princehof burnt. The storehouse, the church, and the Princehof itself were all badly damaged in that fire. Now, the Princehof was reconstructed, and reports are that it was even more lavish than its original construction. But the search for evidence of that building today, you can see a drawing at the bottom of the screen that shows a gray outline of what was believed to be the Princehof, with a few stones on the left side and then red lines of a foundation of a 1740s English style smaller house that was built later and borrowed the some of the bricks and foundation stones from the Princehof, purportedly, which was the practice of the day, to use the remains of an older building when building a newer building. Becker excavated here in 1976 and thought that it was probable that that was the location of Princehof, but it has still not been located. So how many buildings were there in New Sweden? No less of an authority than Dr. Amandus Johnson reports that he estimates that there were 1,000 buildings in all within the boundaries of the New Sweden colony. However, my research indicates that that is probably an overstatement. Reasoning, with a maximum of 300 to 350 settlers at its apex, which is at the very end of the colony, and an average of 4 to 6 residents per building, that would be less than 75 buildings just to house those folks. And then with their outbuildings, and you see some outbuildings in this collage, a smokehouse, the granary, a little storehouse on stilts, that would add another 100 to 200 incidental buildings. And then we count a handful of public buildings, churches, storehouses, and forts. The total comes to only about 280 buildings in total. The conquest by the Dutch, followed in short order by the overwhelming numbers of English settlers, brought about new and different styles of housing, constructed using demonstratively different building materials and techniques. However, the Swedish influence and the use of Swedish carpenters continued for about another 50 years to about 1700. Just as a proper stuga replaced the primitive eld house in Sweden, framed architecture, siding, access to stone and brick changed the housing of the Dutch, English, and Swedes who were living in the area at the time. Folk architecture was supplanted by planned structures. Primitive log cabins were torn down or used as starter houses or outbuildings. A few were anglicized. Now let's look at that idea. Anglicization of Swedish farmsteads. You see a newly arrived couple from England who are about to occupy this cabin, and Mary says, "John, I've agreed to live here until we get a bigger house, but I want walls that are whitewashed, and I want real glass windows in a useful second floor with some real stairs. I am not climbing a ladder to get there." And her husband, John, replies, "Yes, dear." So let's look at the Lower Swedish cabin, the one pictured here, because it does have some great examples of how the English anglicized a Swedish log cabin. So the original cabin had shutters, not windows, whereas the English brought glass windows. The inside logs were left natural. The English whitewashed the insides of the cabin to brighten them up. Loft space was over the main floor, 2 large shelves where at the fireplace end the children slept, and on the underheated side, things like the big pot to cook the pig in were stored until they were needed. On the English side, the roof was raised and completely floored over, the brown stripe representing the wooden flooring. Access to the lofts in the Swedish version were by loft ladder, whereas a set of stairs, in this case, we can date this set of stairs to about 1750 because of the style of stairs it is. It's called a half box binder set of stairs that are in the cabin now. Clay floors were in the main original cabin, and then the English brought in the wooden planks. So they anglicized that building for their use until their new house was ready to occupy. So there have been a series of events that have occurred in the last 100 years that were special anniversaries, and each time one occurred, they brought new attention to both America's past and in particular New Sweden's past. So the first was the sesquicentennial in 1926, headquartered here in Philadelphia. In 1938, we had the 300th anniversary of the settlement of the colony of New Sweden. Then in 1976, we had the American bicentennial, again headquartered here in Philadelphia. And then finally, and most recently, we had in 1988, the 350th anniversary of New Sweden. Each time one of these anniversaries occurred, there was a renewed effort to find, restore, preserve, protect the remnants, the physical remnants of New Sweden. So let's look at each of those and some of the highlights of those anniversaries. In 1926, the colonial revival movement swept through American architecture, especially in suburbs. There was a great movement of people out of the cities into suburbs, and they needed new housing, and the style of housing that was built was generally referred to as colonial revival. My house here in Delaware County, west of Philadelphia, is a colonial revival house. The American Swedish Museum was founded by Dr. Amandus Johnson in South Philadelphia. See a picture of it. And a Norse water wheel was reconstructed at the Bluebell Tavern in place of where Governor Prince's mill existed in the era of New Sweden. In 1938, the 300th anniversary of New Sweden, the rocks were dedicated. It was not the precise site because no one knew the precise site of the landing, but the rocks were dedicated and a memorial was erected. Dubious discoveries were made to kind of force the connection, US history, Swedish history. The Morton House became the prize of that search. It was uncovered. The bottom picture shows it in place when it was part of other houses in a row there in Tinicum. Those other houses were torn down, and a carpenter from Sweden was brought over to restore the double pen Mortensen house, because Mortensen was one of the early settlers of the colony of New Sweden, and his grandson, John Morton, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So it was considered to be a double win to restore that house. Unfortunately, the prevailing technology at the time was also being used by the telephone companies and the electric companies to protect their poles from insects and weather, and that was called creosote. And it's almost a form of tar, and it can totally blacken the building. If you've ever wondered why the Mortensen house is black, it's because in 1938, to blend the new carpentry and the old, the carpenter applied a heavy coating of creosote to protect the building. The HABs, this is very important. The Historic American Building Survey of the 1930s was wrapping up, and it included sending architects out and photographers to catalog historic buildings across America. And fortunately for us, a number of buildings in the Delaware River Valley were recorded in this survey. We have a nice set of drawings and photographs of both the upper and lower Swedish cabin from that survey. Also, an excavation of the Prince-Off was done by Kadzo. Unfortunately, his field notes were all lost. And so one of the big remainders from that effort were a pile of yellow bricks, believed to be from the Prince-Hall. In 1976, we had the U.S. Bicentennial, where we and Roots became both a best-selling book and a much-watched television series. People were looking both into their genealogy, and a new attention was being paid to local history. Archaeology at the Prince-Hall was done, this time by Marshall Becker, and we saw the drawing of his site there when we looked at the Prince-Hall. Historic restorations were made with good intentions. Here we have Harry Rink using plastic body compound from an auto body shop to fill in chinks in his logs there at the Northnagle cabin in New Jersey. In 1988, the 350th anniversary of New Sweden, pressure was on to find places that the King and Queen of Sweden could visit on that anniversary. And when not too many could be found, we decided to construct a few. So Gunnar Zeidqvist and an assistant came over from Sweden and were about to reconstruct a farmstead in Salem. There was a dispute and the farmstead moved to Swedesboro, and Salem was left with a small sod-roofed cabin, and the farmstead in New Jersey was constructed there, and that's what the King and Queen visited. The Lower Swedish cabin was restored at the time, won some awards for its restoration. Unfortunately, the work did not finish in time to be visited by the King and Queen. There were also has been some accidental discoveries. In Delaware, a log house was found along Old State Road north of Wilmington in 1951 by W.A. Westlogger on his way to work. And he stopped, saw that it had some fire damage, did some archaeology there, and decided that the building was worth saving, and it was eventually moved to the State Museum in Dover in 1953. Meanwhile, coming forward a few years, 20 years, the New Sweden granary was found inside a barn in Hopewell Township, New Jersey, and moved intact to its current location. And some reconstruction was done on it around the time of its movement. We're having another presentation as part of this conference on Dutch architecture, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I will call attention to the fact that the Dutch did have influence on construction at the time, although no physical evidence has ever been found of the Dutch whaling station called Zwanendal that existed in Lewis. You see the museum in Lewis that was built on the 300th anniversary of the founding of Zwanendal in 1931, and it's a nice museum to visit. Hendrickson House is on a lot of people's minds. It was existing in Chester, PA, had some Swedish residents, people with New Sweden ancestry, but it's clearly in the rural Dutch building tradition with its roof line and stone construction, very similar to the Caleb Pusey House, which was done in 1683. And it's still existing in Uppland, which was an area of Finns during the time of New Sweden. It was a house that was visited by William Penn. And then you have an example of a house similar to my house in the sense that it was built during that colonial revival architectural time in the late 1920s. This one being a Dutch colonial house, and you see the similarities of styles. I have those three buildings pointing in the same direction so that you can see those similarities. English architecture, again, Jane Fever found only 5 examples existing in Philadelphia when she went to do her book in '75. And I've included a couple of them here. The Bartram House was occupied by a probable Swedish family in a much smaller dwelling. before the property was bought by John Bartram, the famous botanist. And he, in an act of grandiose, self-taught architectural, built, designed, and decorated this house in 1731. Gloria Dei All Sweets Church just snuck under the line because it started its construction in 1690, but is clearly in the English style masonry construction. The Pennsbury Manor is an interesting story. It was Penn's house. It was kind of his version of the Prince-Off for when he was here with his colony. But it was allowed to deteriorate over the years. And in 1939-40, the state of Pennsylvania took it on and completely rebuilt it. And it's still in operation today. Swedish and Dutch forts share a kind of a common storyline in the sense that they were hastily built on low, swampy ground in strategic waterways along the river to protect the settlements upriver from ships coming in downriver. But they had a lot of problems. They were hastily built to meet a military need or emergency. Were never occupied by more than a handful of soldiers, had a few cannons and almost never had enough powder. Supplies were few and far between, and the mosquitoes were terrible. We see an illustration on the map here of Fort Nya Elsborg, which the soldiers who were stationed there renamed Fort Mosquito. And if you've ever seen those shirts that show an enlarged mosquito and say New Jersey State Bird, you know what they were going through being stationed out there in the swampland along the river. So these buildings were abandoned or readily surrendered if superior forces were to approach them. And an abandoned building deteriorates pretty quickly, especially if it's uncared for and out in wet weather where there's flooding and storms. And it's been difficult finding the location. We have another presentation on Fort Casimir in this presentation, so I call your attention to that. It will look at that and the difficulty in actually finding the building itself. So we're winding down now, and I feel an urgent need to call to your attention the deterioration of what some of the writers have referred to as our relics, the physical remains of our past in New Sweden. And you see the buildings represented on the right are all gone. We'll start there at the top of the row. That's the Upper Swedish cabin, which was a companion to and almost a twin to the Lower Swedish cabin. This building was in the process of being restored in 1982 when it caught fire and was all but destroyed and then dismantled and supposedly went into storage but could never be found again. The building in the middle is at 59th and Woodland in Philadelphia, was referred to as the Swedish farmhouse because it was of log construction, but it was also torn down as part of the redevelopment of Southwest Philadelphia. And then finally, kind of sad, the cabin there was saved by removing it from a heavily trafficked intersection in Wilmington area and moved to the rocks to represent the early settlement there. And then it was vandalized and a couple fires were set there, and eventually that building was dismantled and is gone. The top picture undergoing is that heavily creosoted, still looking as black as the day it was built, the Mortensen house in Tinicum Township, the same township that's administering the New Sweden farmstead. And it shows signs of deterioration. You look at those little gable windows, they're not broken out, they have physically collapsed. And I talked to a man who was a caretaker who sometimes cuts the grass there, who's gone up with his own tools and ladders and made repairs on his own, feeling so bad for the building that he feels should be protected. And then finally, upper right-hand corner, we have the Nothnagel cabin in Gibbstown, New Jersey, that is currently on the market with its surrounding property, I think of about 26 acres for slightly over $1 million. And as far as I can tell, there's been very little response in the market for this house. And I fear that a new buyer will not take the time or the resources that are going to be needed to get that slightly newer house at the end of the era of New Sweden restored if the property gets sold, and I'm afraid it's going to further deteriorate waiting for sale. So I wanted to end with some good news, and the good news is that there are some recent developments that give me hope. One is the fact that the United States government saw fit to give the state of Delaware its first national park, as in fact what some people have called a string of pearls, 6 important sites throughout the state of Delaware that together constitute the first state national park, and the Kelmar-Nickel shipyard and parts of the Christina Riverfront in Wilmington are part of that park. And so we have a picture there of the Rocks Monument, the reconstructed Kelmar-Nickel, and then a peek inside the Kelmar-Nickel Museum where a representation of a Swedish cabin has been built. I haven't gotten a chance to see inside that reconstruction, but I want to get there and see it. And then finally, we have the concerted effort of the Swedish Colonial Society to recover the Swedish farmstead that was constructed in New Jersey, but then abandoned and neglected, had it dismantled, put into storage, brought to Pennsylvania to Prince Park in Tinicum, where it's being reconstructed by Amish workers and will constitute a park, not unlike the parks in Sweden, that show life in earlier times. So we have some promising things on the horizon. But in closing, I want to say that in many ways, the colony of New Sweden was a doomed enterprise that suffered numerous ongoing hardships. Among these were royal indifference, infrequent supply ships, and a small number of settlers, many of whom preferred the solitary life of an isolated homestead to the official colony. It was overmatched by its colonial neighbors to the north and south, who had vested interests in New Sweden not succeeding. While the northern neighbor Holland worked to undermine New Sweden's economic base, its southern neighbor England, following a very large land grant by the king to real estate speculator William Penn, overwhelmed the lands of New Sweden with new settlers, and it quickly became an English colony that contained Swedish and Finnish residents. In fact, the fact that any physical architecture from this ill-fated 17-year period remains is more than one can expect. Certainly the lower Swedish cabin in Pennsylvania and the Swedish granary in New Jersey are exceptions, and definitely from that period. Hybrids built under the Dutch and then the English rule are connected by a dotted line. The search goes on while some remnants are literally disappearing, as that last slide. The years 2026 and 2038 will again bring upon anniversaries that will remind us of our colonial past here in its cradle of democracy. But in the meantime, additional efforts must be made to assure future generations that this remaining evidence will always be preserved and cherished. So again, I remind you of the 3 other presentations that constitute this conference, and there will be an opportunity to question each of the presenters either in writing or live on a panel discussion at 1 p.m. on 10/31. Check your program for the details of how to submit a question. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, George, for that presentation. However, I do have one comment to make. The Kalmar Nickel and the Kalmar Nickel Shipyard are not part of the First State National Historical Park. Fort Christina is part of that, and the staff of the Kalmar Nickel actually give tours there.
Okay.
But everybody works together in this whole First State Park. To submit questions, as George mentioned, you can for the panel. Send them by email to nshc@americanswedish.org. Again, that's nshc@americanswedish.org. George, thank you so much for that presentation. And I look forward to seeing you again on Saturday, October 31st for the live webinar.
Should we wear a mask or not?
I think that we might be able not to, just like we're doing today.
But it's Halloween.
Oh, well, maybe we should wear our Swedish costumes.
I could do that.
Okay, your peddler outfit.
Okay. Did you get a time on that?
It was about just a little longer than 30 minutes.
Okay.
I'm trying to stop my